Chapter 1. William Shakespeare's Othello, Impediments to Love. Aims. This chapter will introduce you to reading a Shakespeare play text closely, attending to the language, dramatic techniques, and performance possibilities. Introduce you to the techniques of characterization in Othello. Introduce you to the treatment of the theme of love in Othello, focusing on Act 1. Introduce related themes and concerns of the play, such as those of race or difference. Introduction. One of William Shakespeare's most well-known sonnets begins, "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments." Love and the impediments to love make up one of the great themes of literature. In the Renaissance, it was a theme that provided endless scope for poets and dramatists, and Shakespeare developed it in plays as various as Romeo and Juliet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, As You Like It, and Othello. In comedies like A Midsummer Night's Dream, love triumphs over adversity, and the conclusion is marriage. But in the play that concerns us here, Othello, first performed in 1604, the love of the two characters at its center is met by jealousy, hate, treachery, and finally death. It is a play that feels very close to us in its focus on feelings, with which we're familiar. In fact, in the theater, the intensity with which it depicts those feelings has led audience members sometimes to cry out to the characters in fear or warning. This reminds us how important it is to think about how a play comes across in performance. A willingness to use our imagination to look for the meanings in the extraordinarily rich yet sometimes also obscure words of the text can take us a good way towards understanding and enjoying what we're seeing, on the page as well as on the stage. Stage directions and explanations can be a help, although you may not find very many of these in Shakespeare's texts, and some you will find will have been added later by editors, so you must watch out for indications of the look, "Who comes here?" type when reading the text. This connects with the way in which the concept of the text is dealt with in this chapter, and indeed throughout this part of the book, not only as a matter of close scrutiny of the words on the page, but also as a recognition that a text is not necessarily fixed, despite appearing in a print. A play text is a script for a performance, which is always a group product, the result of decisions about the text taken by all those involved in a production, to a greater or lesser degree. This may well lead to revisions, excisions, and other alterations, even apart from the fact that in any given performance, actors may add or delete things. In the theater, a play will run for just an evening, lasting a few hours. Our journey as readers will be longer, since we'll be pausing frequently to read and reread the text and to think about what we are reading, and working out how to express our views about its concerns. Understanding this distinction should mean that when you come across this play and others by Shakespeare, you will enjoy it with greater understanding and insight than before. It's often said that you must see a Shakespeare play before you read it. Like other playwrights of his time, Shakespeare wrote his plays principally for the stage, with the intention that actors would speak his words in front of audiences rather than for readers to read them in book form. However, he may well have expected his plays to be published together after his death, and indeed, roughly a half of his plays were published during his lifetime. Initially, these were in a kind of paperback known as a quarto, so called because they were made from paper folded twice to make 4 leaves, 22 by 16 centimeters in size. When Othello was first published in 1622, it was as a quarto. A year later, in 1623, it was published in a collection of his plays in a more prestigious format, a folio, in which the paper is folded only once, making a large book about 45 by 32 centimeters in size. This was the first folio, or F1. There are some important differences between these two published texts, which I will refer to later. This important point here is that we cannot always be certain exactly what Shakespeare wrote or which version of the play text was performed in the early 17th century. Reading the play. The edition of the play that is referred to in chapters 1 and 2 is the Oxford World's Classics 2008 edition, edited by Michael Neal. This was a choice determined not only by quality and availability, but by the extensive introductory remarks on staging and performance history, including production photographs and related artwork. You are not expected to read Neil's introduction unless you wish to do so, but rather to begin your reading of the playtext. This chapter will concentrate on the first act of the play, and Chapter 2 will consider Acts 2 to 5. You should ensure that you have read the relevant parts of the play before starting the chapters. Act 1. Scene 1. Making a Start. As you can see in Figure 1.1, the play's full title is The Tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice. This title gives a few clues about the nature and content of the play. A contemporary audience would know what to expect from its being called a tragedy. The term signified a play involving the death of a great or noble person. Second, the main character or tragic hero is called Othello, who is a Moor. The Moors were the Muslim inhabitants of North Africa, mainly Morocco and Algeria. In the 18th century, they conquered much of present-day Spain, which was not reconquered until the 15th century. Moors were considered heathens, although some became Christians after the reconquest. By the time that Othello appeared on the stage, there was a tradition of African characters being called Moors, and the term blackamoor came to be used derogatorily of any person considered black-skinned. There were villainous Moors, such as the character Aaron in Shakespeare's earlier play Titus Andronicus 1592-1593. There were also white or tawny Moors whose blackness was not emphasized and who were usually portrayed as dignified Oriental rulers, like the character Morocco in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, 1596. The original audience would no doubt have waited with interest to see what kind of Moor Othello is. The play Othello begins like this. Enter Rodrigo and Iago. And I quote, Rodrigo, Tush, never tell me, I take it much unkindly that thou, Iago, who hast had my purse, as if the strings were thine, shouldst know of this. Iago, 'Sblood, but you'll not hear me. If ever I did dream of such a matter, abhor me. Rodrigo, thou toldst me thou didst hold him in thy hate. Iago, despise me if I do not. I've always found these opening lines a bit of a puzzle in the theater, the actors rattling them off before I have settled down to listen properly. Furthermore, expressions like tush and never tell me sound like something from another world, and of course in a sense they are, having been written some 400 years ago. But do not be put off. Tush is glossed by Michael Neal as a mild expletive, and together the opening sentences mean something like rubbish, don't give me that. What they're referred to is only made clear later. If it all seems somewhat puzzling, well, that is the point. We are expected to want to know what is going on, who these characters are, and even more significantly, to whom and what they're referring. Our curiosity is stirred as we overhear a conversation that has apparently been going on for a bit, an opening ploy typical of many plays before and since. Until you get used to it, the language of the play may well seem strange, such as the expression "sblood," which is short for God's blood, an oath considered so strong it was cut from later published texts of the play, as were other oaths. Then there are all those thou and thine forms in use at the time. I'll come back to this. But the overall sense seems clear enough, doesn't it? To be sure, you can agree. Try the following activity. Activity 1. Reread Act 1, Scene 1, from the beginning through to line 81 and the entry of Brabantio, not paying too much attention to any difficult words or phrases or the editorial notes, but simply trying to get a gist of what is going on. Try to summarize where the play has got to by the end of the dialogue between Iago and Rodrigo by answering the following questions in a sentence or two for each. What have we learned about the relationship between Iago and Rodrigo from these opening lines? What is Iago apparently most concerned about in this opening section of the play? What do you make of Iago's tone when he refers to Othello as his moorship in line 32? Respectful? Mocking? Consider the context carefully. How far are we prepared for what happens next in the play? Discussion. Below are my responses. Don't worry if they differ somewhat from your own. 1. Rodrigo is dependent on Iago, who has been using his money for some purpose not yet made clear. Iago also appears to rely on Rodrigo in some way. 2. Iago has been passed over for promotion, and consequently feels both angry and humiliated. This is perhaps the most obviously important thing to emerge from the opening moments of the play. 3. Iago's tone is sarcastic or mocking, and hardly respectful. When you think that he is apparently referring to his army superior as his moorship, a pun on his worship, you can see that he is undermining the conventional sense of the term for someone of higher status. 4. We have been prepared for some kind of conspiracy or disruption. We gather one has already been set afoot, as Iago eggs Rodrigo on to incense Brabantio. Who is her father? We do not know who she is yet. You may have noticed that Rodrigo addresses Iago as thou, while Iago uses the you form of the personal pronoun to Rodrigo. That is, Iago addresses Rodrigo in the polite form, as someone of an inferior rank should. He also calls him sir. While at the same time, it becomes clear that Iago is actually the dominant force in these exchanges, which have to do with some kind of betrayal regarding Rodrigo's money. We do not know who the him is in line 9, though by the end of Iago's first speech, we guess that the person referred to several times thereafter is his moorship. In fact, it is not until Othello's entry in Act 1, Scene 3 that he is dignified with a personal name. This is a process repeated throughout the play. We hear people's views of Othello as a kind of build-up before we see or hear him in person. What is being established at this point in the play is Iago's behavior and character traits, and to a lesser extent, those of Rodrigo. Iago seems to be adept at manipulating those around him, and his expression of resentment at being passed over by his moorship highlights his disdain, as well as his verbal inventiveness. Shakespeare shows this by contrasting Iago's quickness with Rodrigo's brief and rather dim responses. From the start, then, Iago seems to be presented to us as a bluff and somewhat cynical soldier, who sets up the duffer Rodrigo to play a prank on old Brabantio. If we did not know the play was going to be a tragedy, we might take it as a comedy at this stage. We are also led by the opening speeches to appreciate Iago's alertness, and his readiness to attack those who believes have been given preference over him, notably Cassio. Cassio is referred to as an arithmetician, meaning someone who knows about the abstract theory of war rather than the practicalities of soldiering, which Iago suggests he himself is skilled in, and therefore more deserving of advancement. The dismissive, alliterative phrase, mere prattle without practice, is memorable, sounding like a cleverly damning remark about Cassio, the Florentine, citizen of Florence. Another point worth making here, since Iago's language is at times quite complex and obscure, is that this obscurity in itself seems to be an aspect of Shakespeare's characterization of him. Iago teases and baffles others by speaking in a way that appears at first to be impressively sensible, but which on closer inspection seems empty, or to reflect badly on the speaker. An example is the speech beginning, "We cannot all be masters," which ends with the sinister, "I am not what I am." Well, what is he then? He is someone who seems to be saying he will not show everyone who and what he is, thereby pursuing his peculiar end. That is, his own specific aims and ambitions. Peculiar in early modern English is not the same as the modern odd or weird. "I am not what I am" is a key remark, coming at the end of a speech in which, through a variety of expressions, Iago has effectively announced the kind of person he is. By his wit and energy, he invites us to admire him before we realize what the outcome of his behavior might be. If Rodrigo is being turned into Iago's audience, so are we. And, as you'll see, Iago increasingly turns to the audience to let us know what he is thinking. It is important to notice that, as usual with Shakespeare, such speeches do much more than simply engage us with the plot, which, up to this point, has barely begun. Read these words of Iago's again, and I quote, "Were I the Moor, I would not be Iago. In following him, I follow but myself. Heaven is my judge, not I for love and duty, but seeming so for my peculiar end. For when my outward action doth demonstrate the native act and figure of my heart, in compliment extern, 'tis not long after. but I will wear my heart upon my sleeve, for those that peck at I am not what I am. In trying to follow this thought, you become aware of how devious Iago is, and also how cleverly he manages to project himself and to dominate Rodrigo. Only when you look closely at his tortuous syntax or word order, do all those buts really make an argument? And grasp the emptiness of some of his phrases, do you realize, as will be confirmed later, how manipulative he is? What is Iago saying when he opposes the native act and figure of my heart to outward action? Simply put, he is saying that if his outward behavior were to become a reflection of his innermost feelings and intentions, then he would in effect be wearing his heart on his sleeve, for those to peck at. That is dangerously exposing his inner self to everyone. The familiar proverbial expression, wearing your heart on your sleeve, in itself a figurative or metaphorical way of putting it. Figurative language is language used in a non-literal way. No one ever really wears their heart on their sleeve. What the expression conveys is how it can feel to open up one's heart to others unreservedly. The familiarity of such a phrase helps us to understand what's being said here. Shakespeare uses a proverbial expression at this point in the play to convey to his audience an important feature of Iago's character, that he is intent on hiding his inner self from others. Let's think now about the fact that Shakespeare is creating Iago's character in verse, specifically in lines of unrhymed iambic pentameter, or blank verse, the favorite medium of drama of the time. Here follows a brief technical digression, containing ideas with which you may already be familiar. The rhythm of a line of verse is provided by the repetition of stressed and unstressed syllables. And an iambic line contains a pattern of rhythmic units in which an unstressed or weak syllable is followed by a stressed or strong syllable, like the word restrict overemphasized to make the point. To define the rhythm of a line, the syllables are divided into measures, feet or meters. A line of 10 syllables can be divided into 5 feet. The technical term is pentameter, from the Greek penta, for 5, and meter for measure. So an iambic pentameter is a line of 10 syllables that fall into 5 measures of 2 syllables each, in which one unstressed syllable is followed by one stressed syllable. Thus, from Iago's speech, line 62. The native act and figure of my heart can be rendered like this, marked with capitals and slashes to bring out the rhythm. The native act and figure of my heart. This is overdoing it, but I hope you can see what I mean. Notice that the rhythmic divisions do not necessarily coincide with the words. This is a standard iambic pentameter line. What you will quickly realize when you look for this pattern in other lines is that many lines vary from this basic beat. They have to, or our ears would quickly become bored. But the variation is always upon this basic rhythm. There were 2 main reasons why blank verse was used by Shakespeare and his contemporaries. First, it is easy to say a line like this so that it sounds natural, because the rhythm is based on the rhythm of everyday English speech. The absence of rhythm intensifies this effect. Second, an iambic pentameter line is easier to memorize than a longer line or more complicated rhythm. This would have been very helpful to actors who at the time